Hi everyone, welcome back to the Property Finance Podcast, and today we're going to do something a little bit different. So I've got my mobile phone with me, and I have basically asked ChatGPT what are the main questions when it comes to development finance. So I thought this would be a fun little spin just to see, one, what AI comes up with as what it believes is the main questions, but also actually to answer some of the main questions. So the first question that ChatGPT has come up with is, what are the main types of finance available for property development? So this is a relatively easy one to answer. So you have essentially three main types. So you've got your debt, which is, it could be senior debt, which is your standard form of development finance, normally up to 65% loan to GDV, up to maybe 85, 90% loan to cost. You've then got your stretch senior debt, which normally goes up to 70% loan to GDV. And then you've potentially got mezzanine finance, which normally sits at about 75% loan to GDV as well. That's normally on a second charge. So senior debt and stretch senior debt sits on a first charge, and then mezzanine sits on a second charge. You've then also got equity finance. So this is where potentially you have a private investor come in and put in that 10% loan to cost, and they may sit on a second charge, third charge, depending on what they're doing, or a debenture, possibly even come in on a joint venture as well. And then lastly, we've kind of got a hybrid of the two, which is talking about crowdfunding. So that could be crowdfunding the actual debt, or it could be crowdfunding the equity. So we deal with quite a few peer-to-peer platforms who basically fund the two. So the second question that ChatGPT has asked is, how does development finance differ from traditional property mortgages? So this is basically talking about why you would use development finance as opposed to a buy-to-let mortgage, for example. And there are a number of reasons. So if we just talk about standard refurb to begin with, so in terms of why would I go and buy a property with a refurb loan as opposed to a buy-to-let mortgage, normally most of the time it's because the property isn't mortgage ready. So it may not have a kitchen, may not have a bathroom, may just not be up to scratch in terms of what you would want for a buy-to-let property. When it comes to land development, you're never going to get a buy-to-let on that anyway. So development finance is there essentially to cover a percentage of the purchase and then normally 100% of the build costs. So the reason why you would use development finance rather than a buy-to-let is purely because you want to leverage as high as possible. So you want to take maybe 70% of the purchase and then 100% of the build behind that as well, as opposed to just taking 75% of the day one. The third question that ChatGPT has asked is, what are the pros and cons of using bridging loans for property development? Well, I can tell you straight off the bat that there are no pros for using bridging finance for property development. The reason being is because bridging finance purely just gives a percentage of the purchase. It gives nothing towards the build whatsoever. If there is a bridging lender who is offering to do a portion of the purchase and also give funds, that's not a bridging loan, that's a development loan. So that's why you would use a development loan rather than the bridge. In terms of another one of the cons of using bridging finance for property development is that if a bridging lender is trying to do development finance, they will often do it in a rather backwards way. So normally what you would do with development finance is you would get given a portion of the purchase, you would get given 100% of the development costs in arrears, and basically every time you hit a certain stage, the development finance lender would pay out a chunk of money. When a bridging lender tries to moonlight as a development lender, what happens is they offer you 75% of what the property is worth now. And then what they do is they just keep revaluing the property and then giving you 75% of what the new valuation is. So you have no way of knowing what you're actually going to get down the line because it completely depends on valuer's opinion, etc. The risk you also run is that with many refurbs, if you're going back to brick or doing a complete renovation, you might be demolishing part of the property, whatever, there's going to be a point where actually the value of the property drops before it increases. So you may find that you have a cash flow shortfall because actually you go and do a load of work, rip out the property, demolish it, whatever, then go and do your first drawdown. The bridging lender sends out a valuer, says, right, you can have 75% of, oh, hang on a minute, the value's gone down. So actually then you've got 75% of a lower figure, which means that you're then in negative equity as far as they're concerned, then causes all kinds of problems. So don't use bridging finance under any circumstances for property development, unless you can afford to do the builds yourself, which I don't think many people can on decent sized developments. The next question that ChatGPT has asked is, what is the typical loan to cost or loan to value ratio for development finance? So we covered this briefly earlier, but as a rule of thumb, senior debt covers about 65% loan to GDV, so loan to gross development value, which is what it's going to be worth when it's finished. or they will cover 85 to 90% loan to cost. So that is loan to purchase plus build, plus maybe some interest as well. When you then get into stretch senior, they then go up to 70% and then probably 90% on loan to cost. And then mezzanine finance pushes that up to 75% loan to GDV as well. You can also get super mezzanine, which is something we've not touched on yet. There's only really one or two providers of that, and it is bloody expensive. But that normally goes up to about 95% loan to cost as well. The next question from ChatGPT is, how are development loans structured? So very simply, development finance is structured in essentially two tranches. So you have your tranche towards the purchase, and then you have your tranche towards the build. So what happens with the tranche towards the purchase is that depending on the loan to values, loan to cost, there will normally be approximately 65%, maybe as low as 60, maybe as high as 70, but normally on average 65% of your initial purchase comes in that first tranche. And then 100% of the build costs should be available to you in this secondary tranche, which you then draw down on as you do works, as you buy materials, etc., and is normally released on a monthly basis, although it can be released kind of as and when you decide. The next question, what is the difference between interest only and repayment loans in development finance? This is where you can tell that this has come from AI, because there is no such thing as a repayment loan in development finance. But what I will do is I'll take this question and I'll kind of reword it myself. And that's to say, what is the difference between retained interest and rolled interest? So with retained interest on development finance, what happens is that a lender will basically work out a cash flow forecast of when you're going to draw monies down and basically then apply interest to that. And what they'll do is they say, right, you can have 65% loan to GDV, but what we're going to do is we're going to deduct interest for, let's say you're doing a development over 18 months, we're going to deduct 18 months worth of interest from you. What that then means is that you then have to go and find obviously a larger deposit because they've taken 18 months worth of interest off you up front. The other problem with retained interest is that they will actually charge that interest based on the gross loan as opposed to the net loan. So in a rather bizarre and backwards way, if you imagine you're borrowing 65% loan to GDV, they then apply interest to that 65% loan to GDV and then reduce that facility by the amount of interest they've just taken off to give you your net facility. So you're not actually paying interest on the net facility, you're paying it on the gross facility. So you're essentially paying interest on interest and interest on the fees and everything else. When it comes to rolled interest, what tends to happen is that they will lend you, let's say 50% loan to GDV or 55% loan to GDV, and then they work out the interest and then roll it on top for the length of time that you then take the facility. The benefit of that is you still end up with probably a similar day one amount, but you're paying interest on the net facility rather than the gross facility. So your interest rate actually works out slightly more appealing throughout that period. And also it gives you more control as well, because you're then, depending on when you take drawdowns, etc., you can forecast yourself as you're going through the project what interest you've taken and what you're going to be hit with at the end as well. Next question, what costs are typically covered by development finance and what expenses must the developer cover upfront? Probably one of the best questions that AI has ever come up with, because I think this is such a underexplained element of development finance. So I think this is a really, really good question. And I'm glad we can cover this, because I've had this recently with quite a few deals where I've kind of spoken to clients and said, well, you need to cover this, this, and this. And all of a sudden it's blown the deal out the water for them. So first off, I'm actually not going to talk about development finance. I'm going to talk about auction purchases. Under no circumstances will a bridging loan, buy-to-let, or development loan cover your deposit when you go to an auction. So if you go to an auction and you win at auction, you are expected to pay that cash yourself, because at that point you are only exchanging contracts. You're not completing on the purchase. So at that point, you need to cover those costs yourself. So that 10% needs to come from you or an investor. However, I think you're going to find it difficult to find an investor because realistically, you're only exchanging, you don't own that property. So you'd have no security to give. The other things that development finance won't cover is stamp duty, legal fees, valuation fees, QS fees. They are the four main costs that you're going to have up front. So your legal fees, your valuation fees, and your QS fees need to be paid before development finance can be drawn down. Stamp duty obviously is paid at the point of purchase. Development finance does not cover stamp duty, so you need to have that cash available in order to pay the stamp duty. The other thing that development finance won't cover is VAT. So if you have VAT on the purchase price, it will not be covered. So you need to cover that VAT yourself and then obviously deal with claiming it back if you can claim it back later down the line. The legal fees as well, just to cover that, is you are going to be responsible for paying for your own legal fees, and you're going to be responsible for paying for the lender's legal fees as well. The other thing that development finance doesn't cover is any architect fees for pre-commencements, any architect fees for getting planning permission, any other sourcing fees that you might have, for example, so they're not going to be covered. Any agent selling fees, they're not going to be covered. So there's all of these professional fees that aren't going to be covered. However, things like project management fees, they can be covered. And obviously any costs that you incur through going to merchants, etc., they would be covered as well. The next question, how should contingency funds be accounted for in the budget? Slightly odd question. So I'm going to reword this one as well. This is the beauty of AI, is that we end up having to go in and reword most of these questions ourselves. What I'm going to reword this to is, what contingency should I allow for development finance? So if you are doing a refurb, I would say 5% is the minimum contingency you want to allow. So this is on your build costs. You work out how much it's going to cost and then add 5%. If you are doing a commercial conversion, you can normally get away with 7.5% to 10%. If you're doing a new build development, I would say between 10 and 15%. And if you're doing a barn conversion, which these can be trickier, but anywhere between 5 and 15%. It's a real range on barn conversions. It really does depend on the state of them, X, Y, Z. But I would say barn conversions really, they cover the whole spectrum, really. So that would really be down to the quantity surveyor to decide. And that's also a key point here as well, is that actually no matter what contingency you put on, if the quantity surveyor goes out and says, we believe it should be 5% higher or 10% higher, they're then going to put what they believe the contingency is, and that will have to be added on as well. And that contingency is included within the 100% build costs that the lender wants to lend. And it's also included within the 65% loan to GDV as well, which means that if you do have a large contingency, you may find yourself having to put more of a deposit in on the purchase as well. Next question. So how can developers minimize interest costs during the project? Realistically, there's only one answer to this. And this is assuming that you've got the best interest rate possible, obviously, through your broker. This is assuming that all of that has been sorted out. But realistically, the only way to minimize your interest cost is by getting sales. So if you're doing a new build development, for example, get sales, get the debt paid off as quickly as possible. So selling off plan, taking deposits, whatnot, trying to clear down as much of that development finance as early as possible. That is going to be the main way to minimize your interest costs. The other way that you could do it, and this only really works if you're kind of a first-time developer, is if you're a first-time developer and you're paying maybe 14% per annum, you could, as soon as the properties get to wind and watertight or practical completion, look to refinance onto a development exit bridge or a sales bridge, and that will be at a lower interest rate. And again, that could maybe bring that cost down ever so slightly. But realistically, the only way to minimize those interest costs is going to be either refinance or sale. That's going to be the quickest way. So ChatGPT has asked, what financial documentation and project plans do lenders typically require? So as a rule of thumb on development finance, the main things we need to go and get an agreement in principle are going to be a build cost breakdown. And that doesn't have to be war and peace. It can just be a very simple breakdown to begin with. We'll normally need a schedule of the properties as well. So how many properties there are, how big they are, i.e. what square footage they are, how much each one's going to be worth individually, build costs per each individual one as well. That normally tends to be that. We also need the CV/experience from the developer. We're also going to need a breakdown of the experience of the contractor as well, and potentially a project manager if there's a project manager involved as well. They're pretty much the only things we need to get to AIP stage. If we want to get from the AIP, which is the agreement in principle stage, onto full-blown offer, we normally need things like the full set of plans, planning permission, probably need to see some discharge or pre-commencements, probably going to need to see all the architect's drawings, probably going to need to deal with the copyright of the architect's drawings as well, probably going to need to go into more detail on that breakdown of costs, probably go into more breakdown on the GDV breakdown as well, which is obviously, like I said, unit sizes, how many units, how large they are in square footage, etc. And then we're going to also need the valuation completing and the quantity surveyor report doing as well. And that will probably then get you to full offer stage, which then moves into legals. Next question is, how important is a developer's track record and experience when securing finance? When it comes to development finance, without a shadow of a doubt, the track record and experience is the most important thing. It is the first thing that lenders will look at before they even look at the costings, before they even look at the project. They're going to look at your experience, or alternatively, the experience of the contractor. So you need to have a good track record. And if you don't have a good track record, you need to have a contractor who's got a good track record. And you need to have a contractor that's completed similar size deals. The amount of deals that we see where clients want to go and build 40 apartments, but they're using a contractor that deals with extensions and conservatories, it's never going to happen. You need a contractor who has dealt with something of a similar size and has done it numerous times as well, because otherwise lenders just aren't going to have the confidence that that deal can be completed. Then the last question that AI has asked in this part of this little two-part series is, what role does a feasibility study play in obtaining funding? This is something that's come up a lot recently for us. So we have started speaking to quantity surveyors about doing feasibility studies. And for those of you that don't know, this is talking about a feasibility study in the sense of sending your costings to a QS and them doing an initial report to say, yeah, we think your costings are okay, or no, your costings are miles off. It's really, really key. The amount of money that you can save as a developer by doing a feasibility study is in the thousands, because by doing that feasibility study, you know before you go and spend any more money whether your costings are going to work, whether there's any potential pitfalls that you're going to have later down the line, and it stops you having to go and pay out for valuations, quantity survey reports, etc. So by spending maybe £1,200, £1,500 on a feasibility study, you very quickly know what you're looking at. And also as part of that feasibility study, there could also be a tendering process as well, which actually then starts to get your contractors lined up and potentially on board. The feasibility study as well, it also plays a large part for the lenders, because obviously we mentioned to get to AIP stage, we need to have a breakdown of build costs. If we can actually send a feasibility report instead, where a QS has actually looked at your build costs and has said, yep, we think these are going to work, we think these are doable, we think the developer is capable of doing this, then obviously that adds a massive amount of sort of support to your deal. So from a lender's perspective, they're going to look at that and go, yeah, great, this is one that we need to spend some time on. This is one that we are happy to push forward with. So in terms of a success rate, I think bringing that feasibility report in adds a massive percentage increase on the success rate. So I would highly recommend getting one done. They're about 4 or 5 pages normally. They can be much longer, but 4 or 5 pages is kind of the average. And normally they cost between $1,000 and $1,500. Again, could be slightly more depending on the size of the project and the complexity of the project. But realistically, you want to be spending between that. So that's the end of part 1 of my little interview with AI. Thank you very much for listening. Catch you on the next one.